Hello, everyone. Let's start today's webinar. I hope you are all hearing me well and seeing me well. So welcome to the number 7 webinar of the EU Horizon project, DiliCHANCE. The webinar is entitled From Complexity to Clarity, Addressing Industry Due Diligence Challenges with a DiliCHANCE Knowledge Base. DiliCHANCE, it's a 3-year EU-funded project aimed at strengthening human rights and environmental due diligence across mineral value chains. Project develops a one-stop platform that helps companies navigate regulatory requirements, enhance responsible sourcing practices, and improve transparency across the mineral sectors. It's a 3-year project that started in 2024 and that will end next year in 2027. I am David Merchin, Head of Business Intelligence at EIT Raw Materials, and I'm happy and honored to be the moderator of this webinar. I say the goal of the DiliCHANCE project is for companies to successfully implement due diligence in the mineral value chain. So that's why before I go into the webinar, a couple of administrative points. So the presentation and the panel discussion is being recorded as we speak. Questions are all welcome. Please submit them in the chat and we will address them at the end of the discussion. You will receive as well the slide deck in a couple of days after the webinar. We are lucky to have today a strong panel with 4 speakers with solid industrial and/or academic experience in the field of responsible sourcing. Elmira Elmani from Glencore, Isadora Costa from EIT Raw Materials, José Dimel from Levin Sources, and Andreas Hendel from Vienna University. We will start this webinar by listening to the voice of the industry. Then, we will dive into 3 key aspects of the DiliCHANCE knowledge base project: regulation, standards, and tools. Let's start with the voice of the industry. Elmira Imani is the group responsible sourcing manager for metals and minerals at Glencore. She's based in Switzerland and she's part of the corporate sustainability department. A lawyer by background, Elmira has led global implementation of responsible sourcing frameworks focusing on third-party due diligence, audit preparedness, and supporting regulatory and external ESG reporting. Elmira, please share with us the key challenges you are facing as an industrial in navigating these due diligence regulations, especially on the human and environmental side.
Thank you, David, for the introduction. Just to step back and give a little context about who we are at a glance. We are one of the world's largest natural resource companies, and we have an important role to play in supporting the global transition to a low-carbon economy. We have operations that are industrial in nature. We have mines, processing facilities that produce metals and minerals that we then on-sell to the market. And we have a trading arm, which means that we are trading third-party material that we purchase. In terms of our policy architecture, it is in accordance to globally recognized standards, internationally known standards such as the OECD due diligence guidance, the UNGPs, ILOs, RBCs. That is the backbone of our responsible sourcing policy architecture. Where we see challenges in this space is with respect to fragmented regulation. Built on similarly aligned principles, but each with very specific requirements, differing effectively. It results in differing reporting timelines, scope, and this is on the next slide, which I've gone into. Lack of clear guidelines that follow regulations. For multinational companies, this is a challenge with respect to implementation expectations. If compliance burdens effectively exceed those in the competing jurisdictions, demand will not stop. It will simply shift to less regulated markets. What that means in practice is if suppliers feel that the requirements, stringent requirements, will disable them from selling to Glencore, they will then find a buyer who they can sell their material to. So it will further reduce our ability to influence responsible production. Our goal should be very pragmatic regulation that achieves the right outcomes without driving the critical minerals outside the reach of the accountable frameworks. We follow a risk-based approach, which flows from identification of conflict-affected and high-risk areas, as stipulated in the OECD due diligence guidance. A practical challenge there is that there is no single unified CARA list. So this creates additional burden where companies' CARA lists differ from each other. Looking at that in practical terms, what it means is if we conduct our due diligence risk assessment or human rights due diligence risk assessment based on what we've identified as conflict-affected high-risk areas, and you further trade that material and on-sell that material to your customers, their CARA list may differ from ours. So that creates this additional tension, commercial tension, where the lists differ. These kind of practical challenges, in effect, take away from resources and the ability to build capacity on the ground, which should be the primary focus of regulation, raising the performance standards in countries and within companies that are producing metals and minerals, which we need for the critical energy transition. So resources could be better used effectively rather than on meeting very, very specific regulatory requirements. We remain pragmatic while doing the right thing. Effectively, we take the time to engage and build capacity where it is feasible, and there is willingness from our supply chain partners in the ecosystem. And believe that tools and platforms like DiliCHANCE is a great initiative, which provides this one-stop navigation where there's a host of not just a regulatory landscape, but standards and tools. And this is exactly what companies need to start embedding due diligence practices in their supply chains. Looking forward, we are looking to convergence and interoperability. That's priority. Having fewer but better aligned standards is the goal that the industry is aiming to achieve. Shared data tools and collective industry leverage will really reduce the burden on all actors while raising the outcome for workers and communities, which is in effect the purpose of regulation. I'll stop there, David.
Yes. Thank you, Elmira, for having shown us, provided us with your point of view as a trader and a miner, and for having expressed the tool and the thing that you would be expected from your side in order to enhance the impact of this due diligence. Now that we have the state-of-the-art industry point of view, we will now focus on the first aspect of the DiliCHANCE knowledge base, which is regulation, and how DiliCHANCE can help companies navigate the evolving regulation, always evolving, in fact, regulation landscape. So Isadora is a senior project officer for responsible sourcing at EIT Raw Materials. She brings over 15 years of international experience addressing supply chain challenges across industries, including aviation, automotive, and mining and metals. She has worked across Africa, Europe, and South America, gaining operational experience in complex global value chains. She's work package leader of the first DiliCHANCE work package, forming the due diligence one-stop shop. Isadora, the floor is in yours, both on regulations and on the tool you're going to present us.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for this kind of word. Now I feel encouraged to speak. So hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all participants for being here. And it's also an honor for me to be the one to share these findings from our regulatory database with the community. It's very important. It's first time that we are sharing those finds. And yeah, so now let's navigate into the regulatory world of the due diligence, environmental and human rights due diligence regulations. Yes, thank you. I was going to say the next slide. So I would like to start with why we need human rights and environmental due diligence in the first place. So many major supply chain tragedies that we saw that happened before Biden due diligence laws exist. So cases like the DRC conflict in 2010 with over 6 million deaths, or the Rana Plaza collapse that happened in Bangladesh in 2013 with over 1,000 deaths and over 2,000 injured. Also the child labor in supply chain issues in 2016. These cases, they show the limits of a voluntary approach. So while you were purchasing your smartphone or your T-shirt, so civil society saw that we were indirectly being responsible for those tragedies. And these events pushed the government to introduce stronger due diligence legislations. Now, let's look at how this regulatory landscape evolved. Perfect, thank you. This timeline shows that it did not appear overnight. It took over a decade. From around the 2020 onwards, the EU began to build a more complete sustainability framework, reporting rules like the CSRD, the financial rules like the SFDR, and due diligence laws like the CSDDD. Now they were all working together to ensure that the companies identify, disclosure, and manage risk in their supply chains. So today focus is shifting from lawmaking to implementation and enforcement. So next slide, please. Yes. So what do we see? We analyzed how today's regulations landscape looks in practice using 41 regulations captured in the DiliCHANCE knowledge base. We can already see some clear trends. For example, mandatory frameworks dominate the landscape with over 70% of the legislation in our database. Over 58% cover all 6 OECD due diligence steps, showing stronger convergence around the OECD model. We have around 1/3 having extraterritorial reach. So this means these laws can apply to companies' activities in other countries, not only where the regulation was adopted. And the most frameworks, 75.6%, are cross-sectorial, so meaning they are not limited to a specific commodity or material. Important also to see in the last lines of the table, you can see there is a strong alignment with international frameworks as the ILO conventions, the OECD guidelines, and the UN guide principles. Next slide, please. So the next question is, where are these laws emerging? So these maps summarize the spread since 2011. So we can see the EU is setting the global benchmark, start with national laws like in France, Germany, and Norway, and also EU-wide instruments such as the CSDDD and the forced labor regulation, so on. So similar approaches are also emerging beyond Europe, like in North America, Asia Pacific, and Latin America. In North America in particular, we see a strong use of trade-based enforcement. For example, customs authorities can stop goods at the border if forced labor is suspected. As you can see, it's a global business requirement and not only a compliance issue. For multinational companies like Glencore and others, this means dealing with different legal approaches at the same time. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this slide draws on a recent OECD study published on April 3rd, analyzed 21 due diligence laws across 11 jurisdictions, which also validates and contextualizes the findings that we had on the DiliCHANCE knowledge base. That's why uh, I I I liked it to include this in the presentation. For example, some of the key finds was a strong convergence around a common due diligence architecture, and this was one of the needs from the companies, as Elmira mentioned. And we see this convergence, for example, with OECD guidelines and also UN guide principles. Also, mandatory expectations increasingly go beyond the company's own operation. So companies are responsible not just for their own operation, but also their suppliers. And very importantly is the significant divergence that remains in scope. For example, some laws apply only to upstream supplies, while others covers the full value chain. Differentiation in prioritization. So some set fixed priority risks that company must address, while others leave it to companies to decide completely. And enforcement. So enforcement, you have range from administrative checks to court action, for example. And last but not least, you have the implementation and enforcement as the main challenge now. Next slide, please. So this landscape is complex and it's evolving as we saw. So how do you navigate it? So this is why we created the Diligence project in the first place. And that's why we have our Diligence knowledge base, because we want to bring everything together in one place in a structured way, and all data that a company needs to understand this landscape. So in the next slides, I will focus on the regulations and how users can explore them in the platform. So the regulations in our knowledge base can be explored through several filters. In the left side of the slide, you can see, for example, geographical focus. And then you can select the European Union region, for example, or individual country like Austria, Belgium, Brazil, France, Germany, so on. You can also filter by international due diligence instrument that's referred. So I want to see on the regulation that is aligned with the ILO conventions or just with the OECD guidelines or the UN guide principles. And you can also filter by type of requirement. So as we saw, like over 70% is mandatory compliance, but you can also select, okay, I want to see only what is voluntary compliance. You can filter by material and commodity focus. We also saw that most of the regulation, they are cross-sectorial, but you can filter, for example, if they have, it's specifically applicable for batteries or material, for example, lithium, copper, tin, etc. You can select by key actions required, and this is very interesting because our knowledge base it's structured around the OECD framework, and these key actions required it's the sixth step of the OECD framework. So you can select a legislation that requires only that companies embed responsible business conduct, or identify and assess impacts, or provide remediation. So all of the six steps. You can select by company size, it's small, startups, all size unspecific. Next slide, please. So for each regulation, the knowledge base will provide this structured overview. So once you select one regulation, you can see in the right side an example of the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. So you will have a short summary of the regulation. You will have a link that link you directly to the official document, so you can read the document right away. And you will have these tags that it's the way that we are provided this information for you in this structured way. So instead of searching across multiple sources, you can quickly access the key elements that you need in one place and one overview. Next slide, please. And now we are moving from understanding the law, because this is only one step, to the next challenge, that is the implementation. So while the knowledge base will help you have this understanding of the regulatory landscape, the mineral trail will help companies in translating this information into practical actions. And we are very proud to officially launch the Mineral Trail tool during this webinar. The Mineral Trail is one of the features of the one-stop shop, our DiliCHANCE platform. And it was led by EIT Raw Materials and co-led by Vienna University, World Resource Forum, Levin Sources, Static, and the WWF. It's a collective approach to develop this great tool. Thank you. The next slide. So the Mineral Trail follows the OECD six-step due diligence framework. And since we focus on mineral value chains, it also builds on the OECD mineral guidance. So the tool is modular, meaning organizations can select the due diligence step most relevant to them. So you can see in the right side, you can select just step 1 or step 1 and 2 or just step 2. So it's completely modular, but I strongly recommend that you do a full assessment and check all your 6 steps. Next slide, please. Thank you. So each module has 6 short questions. I call module each of the steps of the OECD framework. So in the right side, you can see an example of the question. For example, this is question 1.4. It means that it's a question from the module 1, step 1, number 4. So it asks, for example, does your enterprise incorporate responsible business conduct requirements into engagement with suppliers and other business relationships? So you can reply it yes, partially, no, or no. And based on your answer, you get practical and actionable recommendations. So listen carefully, practical and actionable recommendations. So coming from the industry, and I think Miriam will agree with me, so being practical and actionable is very important. So we want to show not only what to improve, being the explanatory phase, but also how to do it. So for example, adding clauses to supply contracts, creating a simple risk checklist, asking suppliers for traceability data, or making clear who in the company is responsible for follow-up. So this is the type of recommendations you will get for every gap that is identified. Next slide, please. So for each gap identified, we also have the resource tab. So the resource tab will present a curated selection from the DiliCHANCE knowledge base. So I presented the regulation aspect of our knowledge base. So, but the mineral trail is connected to all resources we have in the knowledge base. For example, if a company identifies a gap in mapping risk in its supply chain, the tool may recommend using a risk mapping or supply chain traceability tool and link it directly to the tools that it's available in the knowledge base. So that is my last slide. I now just would like to thank you all to spend 15 minutes listening about the regulations. But also I invite you to register in our DiliCHANCE platform and explore the regulations. See, there is regulations of your country, where you have operations. So you check out the countries that you operate, what we have regulations there. And also test our mineral trail tool and do a check assessment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isadora, for having shown us both the evolution of the regulations over time and as well as a very nice and useful and handy mineral trail tool, which is an important part of the one-stop shop. That allows companies to auto-evaluate, to evaluate themselves their due diligence project.
Thank you.
Before focusing on standard, which is the second pillar of after the regulation of the DiliCHANCE project, let me introduce José Dimel, who is a senior advisor for responsible sourcing at Levin Sources. As a sustainability professional with 12 years experience in social sustainability and due diligence in mineral supply chain, she advises companies in the automotive, battery, and energy sector on responsible mineral sourcing. Having worked for 8 years in mining community, she's an expert in international due diligence regulatory frameworks and responsible mining standards. José, please tell us a bit more about the ongoing effort in standard harmonization and if standard is a tool of convergence or of competition between the mineral value chain players. Also, can you introduce us to the voluntary sustainability schemes that exist in the mineral sector?
Thank you, David. Yes, I'd be very happy to do so. Thank you for your kind introduction and happy to be here today. Could you already push us to the next slide, please, David? Thanks. Yeah, so when I created this slide earlier, I doubted a bit for a moment whether I should start with this one, whether it would be a good one, because it's quite complex, lots of information and logos, but then I thought that's what the landscape looks like in reality. The landscape of voluntary standards is a complex one, so I thought let's just dive right into it. I wanted to take you a bit through the evolution of the standards landscape, how standards have come about, what we've seen in terms of trends, how they've been organized over the past years, and I can tell you it's been quite a journey. So let's start in the period between 2006 and 2012, when the evolution or development of voluntary standards for the mineral sector roughly started. So it started with a lot of media and civil society attention focusing on gold and the 3T minerals. I think you all remember the campaigns around blood diamonds and conflict minerals at the time. Isadora already hinted to it in her presentation as well. So around that time, various standards became established around responsible sourcing of gold and 3Ts with the main aim to not contribute to armed conflict. And so it was a very clear material focus at the time around those four materials, and also a very clear risk scope around not contributing to conflict. And so then when we move to the next period between 2006 and 2022, I think you can stick with the former slide. Yes, thanks, David. We see that we see a very rapid proliferation of voluntary standards. One standard after the other became published, and all with a very specific mineral focus. So one standard specifically for aluminium, one for copper, one for steel, one for mica, one for cobalt, and we can go on for a while. So there was a very clear extension of the mineral scope beyond gold and 3T. But we also noticed a change in risk scope, where the previous set of minerals very clearly focused around conflict. The new standards extended the scope to a much broader approach, so going beyond what we call the Annex 2 risks, also including environmental stewardship, human rights, labor and community rights risks. But what we do see very clearly is a continuation in how the standards are set up. So they all follow the traditional 5-step approach that is set out in the OECD minerals guidance, with the exception of IRMA, which takes an UNGP's aligned approach and a mineral agnostic approach. Yes, David, if you can go to the next slide, thanks. So in more recent years, between 2023 and 2025, we've seen that standard setting organizations have slowly started to revise their standards to move from the 5 to a 6-step approach, more aligning with the OECD M&E guidelines and the UNGPs. So paying more attention to remedy is a very important step, an aspect of due diligence, but also focusing more on right holders' engagement as part of the due diligence process. Then a second very important trend that we've seen in this period of time is that you can imagine how this rapid proliferation of standards has led to a very extensive audit and compliance burden for many companies, both downstream and upstream. Almira already hinted towards it, the fact that they're not all convergent in the same direction leads to a lot of administrative burden for many of those companies trying to do due diligence. So there we've seen many standards responding to those requests and starting harmonization efforts. So a very clear one is where we've seen standards developing joint standards, such as the joint due diligence standard for copper, lead, nickel, and zinc, but also the very recent initiative led by the Copper Mark on the Consolidated Mining Standard initiative is a very good example. A lot of effort has gone into recognition between standards. And then over the last couple of months, we've seen standard setting organizations signing MOUs, but also jointly undertaking audits, such as the recent IRMA and Copper Mark joint audit of an Anglo-American site in Peru. I'm looking at this slide. It seems to be stuck. I'm not sure if you see that as well. So in the background, simultaneously to those developments, civil society organizations, but also public institutions, such as the German Office of Export Control, yes, thanks, David, BAFA, have raised concerns around the use of assurance schemes, around their credibility, as well as how they should be appropriately used as part of a broader due diligence process. So they've pointed out that voluntary standards to a significant extent are industry-led and have limited voices of right holders incorporated into their governance systems. There's a lack of transparency in audit reporting around some of these schemes, that not all grievance mechanisms are very effective, and several of those issues. Then additionally, they've reiterated that companies should not over-rely on assurance schemes to do their due diligence. So it retains the responsibility of human rights, of a company to do human rights due diligence, and it cannot be outsourced to a sustainability scheme. So a company should do its own supply chain mapping, its risk identification, and supplier engagement. So I think those are some of the key trends that we've seen over the past couple of years. If you'd like to learn more about standards and around those trends, I would advise you to have a look at the knowledge base on the DiliCHANCE website that Isadora also pointed out in her own presentation, where you can find more information. So as part of the knowledge base, you'll see that there's a standards tab. If you click on it, you'll see a list of 20 different standard setting organizations that you can click on. They're filtered by supply chain focus, so upstream or downstream, or company focused, commodity type, and also linked in how they support compliance with certain regulations, such as the EU batteries regulation, for example. If you click on those standards, you'll see a short summary of the standards, the commodity types and supply chain focus that it has, and a link to the voluntary standard setting organization to dive deeper into its setup and the standards that it has established. David, if you could move to the next slide, thanks. Then I also wanted to point out that we've done an assessment of 20 different standards and assurance schemes, as well as a publication on lighthouse cases of right holders engagement as part of assurance processes. You can find those under the deep dives. As you can see, there's a short summary of the reports and studies that we've done, and you can also link to the original reports to learn more. And then lastly, I wanted to point out that DiliCHANCE has organized a series of webinars, one that specifically it talks about assurance schemes in due diligence, how to make smart use of those. So if you want to learn more about that, I would advise you to also go to the events tab on the DiliCHANCE link. Thank you very much. Please feel free to reach out in case you have any other questions. We'd be happy to chat with you.
Thank you very much, José, for having this presentation and standard, and for having highlighted both the deep dive part and the standards part of the DiliCHANCE website, and also for having shown also the evolution of the standards, which is nice also when we compare it with the evolution of the regulations. Both evolved a lot. Our last speaker now is Andreas Händel. So Andreas Händel is an expert in raw materials and resource policy. He has been so for approximately 15 years, and he possesses extensive experience in policy analysis in the raw material sectors, designing stakeholders and peer learning processes, and developing learning platforms on these topics. Andreas, please tell us a bit more on the opportunity, on what's ahead of us, and on the opportunity that digitalization can bring, and how digitalization and also the market fragmentation of this tool would allow company to have access to a better mapping of the knowledge base.
Thank you, David, and hello, everyone. You can go to the next slide. So just to start briefly with what are we dealing with when we talk about tools, there are three mega trends that currently define how the tool landscape is shaping or is fragmenting or is kind of rapidly developing. So basically what we see, AI and machine learning, is really a rapid evolution of what we consider for the tool market to be a driving aspect, as well as when we look at company performance. On risk-based due diligence, we see a lag. We see that there's high demand for catching up with regulatory requirements, and also what we consider an effective approach for risk-based due diligence, meaning engaging with rights holders and affected groups and communities. That's a story we have throughout the whole Diligence project. We're also looking from a tools perspective onto it. And lastly, and most importantly, I think what we call the EU policy push, with the last 10 years particularly coming up major due diligence, sustainability due diligence, legal trends such as battery regulation, conflict mineral regulation, and the most recent EU corporate social due diligence directive. But we also see a pullback, or kind of pull in the other direction with the recent omnibus package, and a kind of pulling us into different directions in terms of requirements, in terms of expectations, what companies are now dealing with some of the most recent ones, such as the battery, triple CSD, or the reporting directive. And Diligence is really here to make a contribution in terms of making sense and mapping and screening this large landscape of digital tools that are kind of effective with the three mega trends, what we see. And so far, we've reviewed 62 tools on our knowledge base on different topics that are relevant for due diligence, such as risk management, reporting, and engagement with stakeholders, etc. And really to respond to the fast market development cycles, we need to call it, when these three trends converge, and see how that kind of continues in the future. And I want to put a bit of spotlight on that. And there's just a couple of tools in our database mentioned below. So when we talk about tools, we have a very broad understanding, which is basically AI, machine learning, supplier engagement, the big tools such as EcoVadis, such as Previous, such as circular, etc., traceability, blockchain, different technologies. But also we consider quite worthwhile is all the major conceptual and guidance documents, be it on remedy, be it on risk-based due diligence. So that's our understanding of tools, where we started with about 300 identified. We want to end up with 120 most relevant, we think, for companies in the knowledge base. But we don't stop there, actually. We think it's most relevant to really focus on what these tools can bring to companies in terms of added value in their due diligence process, in the internal ones, and also with regards to pitfalls and potential threats they can bring to a due diligence process by really testing 20 of these tools along different areas, and I'll come to that later. And we will also engage in peer learning and exchange meeting with the tool providers to actually improve those tools along what we consider effective human rights and environmental due diligence, help them, support them, bring them to the next level with tool design lab, developing innovation blueprints with a couple of tool providers, and also for all the other ones, and for a general way forward for making effective due diligence tools, a roadmap on what we think in terms of technical aspects, but also in terms of inclusion of rights holders and affected groups and communities, and what role they should play. So really, what's the knowledge base about? It's currently Europe's largest library and digital tools with regards to human rights and environmental due diligence. I want to briefly point out a couple of ways on how you can use that. What are the perspectives of users? What's most relevant and worthwhile maybe looking for when browsing through the library? A couple of options, what you can search for, and a bit of an outlook on future development. Where we want to go with the knowledge base part on the tools. So there's a couple of ways on how you can enter via the Diligence website. You can go through the search function, search through specific terms such as risk management that bring you to tools, but you can also go directly to the knowledge base, to the tools section. I think a couple of links have been pasted into the chat, so you can try out these ones and see whether you find your way through the knowledge base to the tools. There's also a small short featured video which explains to you the basic idea of what we consider as tools in diligence and how the platform, the knowledge base, can help you. Next one. So what to expect when you go into detail? Of course, it's a regular standard data repository and tools where we selected a couple of filter criteria which we think most worthwhile for companies really to browsing through a tools section. Currently, I think most relevant is probably level of expertise, geographic focus, commodity focus. These are just a few ones to mention from that end. On the next one, we'll look at specific examples. So if we look at filter criteria of required level of expertise, I have a couple of options. If I click on those, I get the tools listed and referenced underneath. I can find out more about the individual tools and come to that later. And I can further modify my results with the open search function or adding additional filters if I want to go, for example, for a specific commodity of a specific world region, whether there's a tool open for offer which can help me on that regard. Next one. So if we just look at one of the filter criteria, things that would pop up in your search area, just to briefly contextualize, if you're looking for very baseline competency, beginner, basic level expertise on human rights, environmental due diligence, this is what you would expect. Guidance documents, the European Platform Responsible Minerals Due Diligence Hub, which is also a kind of database and self-check on different materials and sources, and also guidance documents, specific issues or steps of what we consider risk-based due diligence, most importantly, access to remedy and practical guidance by different organizations. When you go towards more what we consider expert level, so you work in your procurement department for several years, you have a very clear understanding on how to engage with your suppliers and build up trust and kind of engage with them to improve things along the supply chain. There's certain tools that can help you with very different features, mostly on AI, machine learning, on blockchain application, etc., that are really on the more sophisticated level of when you engage with due diligence in your various company operations. this is for the mapping and screening so far. If you want to have a more detailed look on the tool in the knowledge base, there's some information generally about the tool, some more specific information with regards to what sector it addresses, what's the prices of using it, if there's a commodity focus, we list that, and also the possibility to get in touch with us in case you have some additional remarks or want to add something to what we've done in the review. So that's a quite basic idea of how the knowledge base functions with regards to tools. Next slide, David. Thank you. So just to briefly wrap it up, so this is a comprehensive mapping where we are at the moment with the tools. So for offering all the different users easy access and filtering through the website and the tools in particular. And what we would like to add, I think, is most importantly, and which would also link it very best to what the standard landscape, the regulation landscape, but also the mineral tail self-assessment tool does to different company users or other ones, is by basically adding how the tools load onto the different OECD guidance steps. So basically, if a tool is able to help you with stakeholder remedy, if a tool is to help you with your reporting or stakeholder engagement, this will come up in the future, along with another 60 tools that we've reviewed, but just right now in the processing, reviewing, and management for the technical upload. So basically, the library is your starting point for getting to know tools. But beyond that, there's more actually, which we want to look into the diligence projects. Next slide, please. So what we see as a clear headlight for us, there's a certain challenges for both the tool users, the companies, but also the providers, the ones who kind of develop or further propagate the tools, the digital ones, the more lower technical mature, but also higher technical mature AI integration, machine learning or blockchain methodologies. We come from the position that we need to acknowledge there was happening procedural simplification, that where we have right now a lot of templates, self-checks, checklists, etc., that helps companies to kind of ease administrative burdens. We also need to see that the current level of technological development offers a very diverse set of tools which are highly specialized, coming from blockchain, coming from AI, coming from major risk assessment, using raw data in a very vast way. And we need to, I think, look into how we can manage this complexity of data and put it into action knowledge for the decision makers into companies. I think we have an upcoming webinar that actually deals with that question of how we can transform vast amounts of data into data visualization that makes sense for companies. So stay tuned with our due diligence newsletter on this one, which will take place end of May. But also, I think most importantly, what we see is, on the one hand, the tools offer a variety of options to really include the voices of affected communities and stakeholders by having different possibilities to use AI. But at the moment, it's more or less conceived as a threat. So while we look into vast amounts of data, of risk assessments, etc., there seems to be a disconnect or a dissociation with really the voices and the impacts on affected groups, stakeholders, and rights holders and the environment. We try to mitigate it by putting a specific spotlight into our tool development, tool improvement department on how really to include stakeholder perspectives into data management, data verification, and inclusion when it comes to tool use. What we've also perceived and seen is that companies really need to be ready to kind of use the more sophisticated advanced tool. And what we currently see is a kind of strategic misalignment. While the tools have very high technical affordance for both in terms of expertise and knowledge, both in terms of company process integration, ERPs, kind of a keyword here, but also in terms of level of expertise. We don't see that companies are quite ready yet for that. There's a quite of overburdening and overflooding of possibilities. And that could really backfire if you not consider this correctly in a lot of different cases, up to the point where the company is outsourcing too much of their knowledge and capabilities into tools that it's eroding its own possibilities to really manage a risk-based approach. So that's kind of what we also see as a trend when we look into the tools. And really that's the next slide, David, thank you, to go beyond the library of just the mapping and to respond to these major challenges, what we will be looking in the future is into tool testing. As Josie already mentioned, we're writing up a couple of deep dive articles which are really putting our brains together and testing the tools on specific topic on various orientations of sustainability due diligence, such as supplier engagement or stakeholder engagement. These are the two aspects we want to look at specifically, but also more the technological aspects, how to make sense of data via visualization, what are possibilities for integration into existing company processes, and really testing the tools 5 to 10 per topic, which we see to the bone of how tools are capable of actually doing that from our end. So overall, we will test 20 plus tools and specifically look into the user experience, strengths and weaknesses, and how they're actually able to support companies in a risk-based due diligence approach. One of them is currently in the pipeline on traceability tools, which is coming up. So keep a look on that one in particular. I think that's it from my end.
Thank you, Andreas, for looking forward for this tool and visualization and working on user experience. I think is clear, but already we see how the variety of tools that the DiliCHANCE offers in terms of and knowledge, in terms of regulation, standards, and tools. And I would like to thank the speakers. And now we still have a couple of minutes for some questions. And I've isolated two questions that I think might be of interest for our speakers. The first one, I believe, can be answered maybe both by Elmira from Glencore and also Jose. And it asks again a question on to have examples on when due diligence in the supply chain has led to tangible, and I think tangible here is the key word, tangible change for those facing potential human rights or labor violations. So, Elmira, maybe you want to start answering on these questions.
Sure, thanks, David. That's a really good question. I think it goes back to what Isadora explained and Jose explained with the history of what had happened in the space. For example, with respect to cobalt mining in the DRC, in investigations into child labor in the artisanal small-scale sector forced the companies to apply pressure to the producers operating in countries such as DRC to audit their suppliers. This led to the Responsible Mineral Initiative expanding its program and leading to smelters being suspended or decertified, which in effect forced sourcing changes on the ground. And that is a positive impact with respect to this process and these regulations. More recent years, the EU conflict mineral regulation has a similar impact with respect to tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold. Importers of these materials into the EU have to meet certain due diligence requirements and ensure that there's traceability in the supply chain. And it goes beyond just reliance on industry certifications. And I can say this from our own experience, to the extent that you have to still you're still responsible to do your own due diligence. What these certifications provide is a level of assurance that there are processes and controls in place for these companies to be able to identify and mitigate risks in their supply chains. So it's a supplement to the company's own due diligence, and it supports it, but it does not replace the need for companies to do their own due diligence.
Yes. Thank you, Elmira, for this example. Maybe Jose, you would like to add a couple of insights on these same questions of tangible change.
Yes, thanks, David. No, I'd be happy to chip in. I think it's a very important question. I think it brings us back to the core, what due diligence is about, right? Improving outcomes for affected people on the ground. So I'm happy to let you know that I do have several examples, I think. But before diving in, I also wanted to let you know, I think I understand where the question comes from. Because if we look at all the regulation that's in place and the complexity of standards, the question is if it in the end indeed leads to improved outcomes for affected people. And I think honestly, not in all cases. I think there's still a lot of practice that is focusing too much on supply chain mapping, on risk identification, rather than supplier engagement and risk mitigation to really make sure that we work towards improved practices. So that's what I highlighted in my presentation. I've heard also other speakers link to, is that it's very important to select your voluntary standards smartly. Those that do engage with right holders, for example, and also understand their limitations and retain your own responsibility to conduct due diligence. So not to over rely on standards and to do your own supplier engagement. So maybe to give you an example in some of the work that we did at Levin Sources, where we supported an EU-based OEM, and we helped them assess one of their cobalt suppliers. And help them understand and prioritize risks around the mining activities of this supplier. The OEM followed up with the cobalt supplier to discuss the identified gaps and risks, and highlighted its own expectations to respect human rights. And with the supplier agreed how over time their management systems could improve and change, including around security providers, for example, contract management and community engagement. So I think that's a very clear example of how understanding risk in your supply chain and then using your leverage and doing supplier engagement can help improve practices on the ground. So I think that's an example that I hope to see more often in the work.
Thank you, José, for this example and indeed this context on the type of standards to apply and what is the key impact and focus. I know we're running a bit out of time, but I would really like to take this last question because it's key. It has been mentioned already. It's do you think the simplification proposed in the omnibus package could undermine the original objectives of the due diligence legislation? Maybe Isadora, you can answer on this one in a short amount of time.
Yes. Okay.
The omnibus.
I knew the omnibus would come. So a quick background, it's the omnibus package moves some of the legislation that we mentioned in this presentation, like the CSRD, the CS-DDD, towards simplification. But however, and this is my opinion, with or without omnibus, what I think we as a policymakers, companies, and civil society, what we need to focus on is to ensure that tragedies like the one mentioned in the presentation as well, that it is will not happen again. And only then can we say that we are doing the right thing and creating a legislative framework that delivers real world outcomes. And it's protecting humanity, it's serving humanity. And how strange is that if not the purpose of why we have companies in the first place, why we need the legislative frameworks in the first place. So that's it.
Andreas, do you want to add something on the tools and the omnibus impact?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are two things. It's a change of expectations of what really legal compliance means for companies, and that company is also a tool provider, tool developer company. So that changed a lot in terms of their development process of tool features, etc., what comes up. So there was a big disruption of kind of firing whole departments of certain major tool providers on major AI tools, but also in terms of tools kind of leaving out certain modules on that compliance issue. That was a major kind of disruption into the tool market, what we've seen. And it's just because, I mean, from a policy draft and revision perspective, it came just on a very short and unexpected notice. And we see this also with the company representatives talking about risk-based due diligence. They need planning horizons, such as tool providers as well, to really respond and kind of fill in that. And on such a short notice, companies, tool providers usually don't kind of change their strategy. They keep continuing on working on that, except for if there's no market to sell tools or specific assets or features of it. They will easily kind of abolish certain departments, certain features of tools. And that's sad to see that that happened on such a short notice and disruptive level.
The stability of legislation is key, especially at European level. Thanks a lot to all of you for the speakers, the question. Thanks. As you can see, our next webinar is on resilience in times of war. It's 20th of May. With 3 speakers, Robert Holsteiner from the Australian Ministry of Finance, Peter Klimek from Supply Chain Intelligence, and Stefan Fink from KPMG. We started at 4:03, so we end at 5:03. There is nothing as free lunch. So sorry for the slight delay. Thanks again for your participation. And with that, let me conclude this webinar. Let me thank again the participants, and let me wish all of you a good end of the day.